Hi, thanks everyone. I'm Zach Seward of Quartz at QZ.com, a business news website from Atlantic Media. And I'll let these two guys introduce themselves rather than my trying myself and butchering it. We've got Jeremy and Raj. Jeremy, why don't you go first? Tell us really briefly, give us the 60-second version of what 2U does, and then, of course, what your role there is.
Of course. Thanks, Zach. And hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Johnson, in from New York. Thank you all for having me. 2U builds infrastructure to support the best online education in the world. And so we've helped a number of U.S. universities, schools like Georgetown, USC, UNC Chapel Hill, Washington University in St. Louis, Notre Dame, build online degree programs and credit granting programs that have the same or better student outcomes, so the same level of rigor, but also the same admission standards, the same degree at the end that you would experience and receive on campus, but they're globally accessible. So you could be here in this class, or here in this auditorium, taking a class from some of America's top schools and pursuing a degree there in a way that, at the high end at least, of American education has never really happened before. And part of why I'm so excited to be here, quite frankly, is that South Korea is one of the most well-educated and, in many ways, rapidly conscious of education of any country in the world. And I'd love to learn more about that. So thank you for having me. And again, co-founder and chief strategy officer of 2U.
Thanks a lot. Raj?
Hi, my name is Raj Sundarason. I work with a German software company called SAP. I manage one of their line of business applications across the Asia Pacific and Japan. It's basically our people solutions, which comprise traditional on-premise software, a BPO offering, and a cloud solution, which some of you may have heard of, SuccessFactors. Within there, obviously, there is a talent suite, which integral to that for us is the learning module, together with a collaboration suite around there, which we're seeing as a major trending piece in the marketplace as the way we learn evolves and changes. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here today.
Thanks a lot, guys. So when we talk about online education, I think a lot of terms get thrown around to mean a lot of different things. So I wanted to throw out the one term that's most voguish in online education and see what it means to you, feelings on it, and go from there. So that's this term MOOC, M-O-O-C, or massive open online courses, a term used to mean, frankly, any type of online education that scales, it seems. Is 2U in the business of providing MOOCs?
So Inside Higher Ed, which is one of the two main sort of educational trade brands in the US, recently called us the anti-MOOC. And the reason for that is MOOCs, by their nature, are really designed for distribution. They're distribution-driven education. And their goal is to maximize sort of access to content knowledge effectively, but in a more interactive way than has historically been available. What we're trying to do is almost the fundamental opposite of that. It's much more about the outcomes that a student will receive as a result of it. And the blessing but also curse of MOOCs is that they've gotten everyone, as you mentioned, Zach, discussing online education. It's become, to say in vogue over the past 2 years would be a massive understatement. But at the same time, 5 years ago when we started, we were crazy. No one was talking about online education. No one thought that grade schools should have anything to do with online education or really anything that was technology-enabled education. And so on one hand, there isn't a school in the US right now, and I don't know as much about sort of the top international schools. We're actually announcing our first 2 international partners in a couple months, but very excited about that. But there isn't a school in the US that doesn't believe now that they should have a digital strategy of some sort, that doesn't have a faculty committee focusing on how that school will leverage technology. And the unfortunate part is that all of them are bundling in, or many of them are bundling it all into, we just need to do something, because there's been such a frenzy over the past 2 years. But the good news is that real discussions are happening. And I think that what schools are looking at right now, and the number of our partners in Semester Online, our undergraduate initiative, are looking at, is sort of a two-pronged approach. And that is, they care about the MOOC sort of phenomenon from the standpoint of branding for the school and really fulfilling the mission of increasing access to some form of education. But they also care about and are choosing to work with Semester Online or to build programs with us because they also care about being able to improve the quality of their own on-campus education and to be able to increase their ability to make an impact on the world. And it turns out that if you care about impact, if you care about outcomes in education, you need more than content knowledge.
We'll say a little bit more about that. What sort of outcomes are you attempting to measure?
So it depends, actually, very significantly between grad school and undergrad and between different types of grad programs. But for instance, let's say that you're interested in getting an MBA from a top American university. The outcomes for something like that are typically going to be things like how much does your salary increase as a result before and after that program? What is the impact on your lifetime expected earnings? What are the opportunities that you will have as a result of that educational experience? The likelihood of you taking an accounting course through a MOOC and having that fundamentally alter the trajectory of your career, quite low. The likelihood of taking completing an MBA from a top 20 American university, for instance, our partner is UNC Chapel Hill, and we've built out the first top 20 online MBA program. Student satisfaction off the charts, job placement off the charts. Those type of outcomes are actually why most people, if they have the opportunity to, and not all people do, and we should seek to increase access to it, but to the extent that you have the opportunity to pursue those type of outcomes, those type of sort of life changes, you would generally want to.
Well, let's stay on this topic of outcomes then, because I think that's a really interesting area and one where some would argue online education differs from traditional education in its relentless focus on measuring outcomes. So I have to assume that enters into play in what you do, Raj, since your clients have to be particularly demanding that they're getting their money's worth.
No, absolutely. But before I go into that, hands up, how many of you have had an experience with some form of online learning? Excellent. Just so you know, I'm no authority on it, but my first experience with online learning was actually with YouTube.
What did you learn?
How to restart my BlackBerry. And I think that in itself is an interesting use case because we traditionally think of learning or education in such a formal, structured environment, but how we learn and how we're ingesting learning has changed so dramatically over the years, and the internet has done such a fabulous job in helping us take that down. I mean, I remember any problem I have today. Right, I don't go to Google anymore. I just go to YouTube because I don't like to read. I like to watch. So off you go. And when we explored what YouTube did for the mass consumer, we tried to apply some of that into what we do with our customers. And what we're seeing now is learning for the sake of learning without solving the business problem is a waste of time. That's the first thing. The second thing that we're finding now is the learning prerogative is even bigger, more so than ever, because in a lot of countries, we're dealing with a shrinking population. If you take Korea, for example, and again, no disrespect to anybody, in the 50s, I believe your family units were larger. It wasn't wrong to have 5, 6, 7 children. Now with the different policies that have been put into place, the average Korean is having less than 2 children. And that's going to place a huge pressure in terms of how organizations get people into their businesses, train them, skill them, experience to get those business outcomes. So I'll give you an example in terms of how one resort is looking at learning in a different paradigm. There is an integrated resort in Singapore that has approximately 2,500 rooms in a hotel. It has approximately 155 room configurations. It runs at 98% occupancy all the year. And above this level of complexity sits something called the magnificent experience that it would like its end customer to have. Now, if you take a step back and you try and figure out how do they actually do it, well, they employ 10,000 people. Out of those 10,000 people, approximately 8,000 of them are the guys and girls who do the work. Out of the 8,000, they have an attrition rate of approximately 30%. So they've got to figure out how to find 2,500 people on average, bring them in, onboard them, get them productive in time to manage this wonderful, magnificent experience. Now, the challenge that they have is that those 2,500 people come from India, China, Philippines, and Malaysia, from different cities, different provinces. Now, for them, the business outcomes is a fundamentally different piece to an individual looking to figure out how to restart his iPad or his BlackBerry. So for us, when we sit down and work with a customer, the business outcome is incredibly important, and to understand that is to understand the business problem.
Well, what is the course that the employees of this resort go through? So, I mean, I assume it's an online course.
It's interesting. How many of you joined a new company and had a wonderful onboarding experience? Probably none of you, because that onboarding experience is not owned by one person. I remember when I joined my second company, I turned up at the front door, and who was there? Someone from HR. They walked me around, showed me around, took me to IT, left me there with my laptop, and that was it. They said, good luck. So, when we're trying to do this, technology plays a really, really important part. But it's not just technology for the sake of technology. It's technology in the context of the business problem. So now, that same resort, if you're a new employee, the day before you arrive, you get an email on your smart device saying, welcome, and I'm your buddy. And it pre-assigns you to groups. And within those groups, say you're in housekeeping, is content, video content, married with collaboration pieces around it. So most of you, I would assume, have a Facebook account, right? Yes?
Does anyone not have a Facebook account?
So, the incredible thing about Facebook is, people like to take photographs, and what they're waiting for is instant gratification, right? So they want this or this. And what we found was if we married content in a collaborative environment where you could ask a question, get an answer to the group, two things happen. You got more engagement, more people actually readily there to share. But the next part, which was really, really interesting, was next time you had a new recruit, you didn't have to worry about answering the question again because it was already there. So you're leveraging video, you're leveraging collaboration in an environment to help accelerate the time to productivity.
That's really interesting. I mean, there's an obvious advantage to online courses that you just touched on. Their ability to collect the collective knowledge of students who have taken the courses in the past. So you see that even with startups. I mean, in engineering world, you have sites like Stack Overflow where engineers are sort of crowdsourcing and collecting their knowledge together through a question and answer format. It sounds like, in the context of an individual resort even, you can have a collective knowledge that gets amassed. Does that concept come into play at all with any of the courses that you're providing? So
Yeah, absolutely. Over the past few years, there actually has been some pretty compelling research that's come out that has shown that actually the most effective learning leverages a couple different things together. There are obvious benefits for that type of collaborative, sort of synchronous or even asynchronous online experience that allows students to connect with each other, but through those type of interactions. At the same time, if you really want to maximize it, you have to take those type of rich interactive experiences and combine them, in most instances, with a real human being. So if you're pursuing higher education, for instance, the optimum experience is to take that type of rich media interactive experience online and then combine that with a real live small group class with a faculty member who knows you, knows your strengths and weaknesses as a student, as a learner, and can help guide you through it. And so technology and those type of experiences can actually enhance the individual sort of one-on-one tutoring or experience of just having a professor, but at the same time, just having those experiences can't replicate having a real human being. So it turns out that both of them together actually create a better experience. And one of the challenges, going back to the beginning of MOOCs, is that if your goal is pure distribution, you have to minimize cost. And the reality is people are expensive. Faculty are expensive. And so the only way you can have that type of optimum outcome is if you have a price point that allows you to have incredibly skilled people managing and supporting those outcomes.
Well, that points to a really interesting issue, the question of scale. So tell me if you think this assessment is wrong. But I think some would argue that the reason there is such investor interest in, call it MOOCs, call it online education, or whatever, is because it takes an industry education that didn't typically have the ability to scale and gives it scale. So what we need to talk about is the limits of scale. It sounds like you're saying, well, that only goes so far, but at the same time, whether it's an investor or a university, the interest lies in being able to take what used to be a class of 1,000 students and push that to, well, I don't know, we're talking 10,000? Is there a limit, or or is Harvard University going to be educating millions of people in the future?
So the question is, what do you mean by educating?
Sure.
And to the extent that you assume that the public libraries around the world are educating people, and for some people that's actually a fantastic form of learning. YouTube, another fantastic form of learning. Yeah, Harvard probably will, through edX, be educating millions of people over the next few years. I think that people misunderstand what the potential total scale is there. They talk about how quickly the MOOCs have gotten to a few million users, but a very small percentage of those users, 7.6% on average, actually finish a course. And so it's a little bit misunderstood in terms of what those numbers really are and how big the phenomenon really is. The reality is iTunes U, which has been around for a lot longer than the MOOC phenomenon, is essentially the same thing and dwarfs the total number of sort of interactions and completions of individual courses, but we just don't talk about it as much.
Has anyone here taken a course over iTunes U? A few hands, sure.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think we're going to see Harvard in that sense educating more people, but educating in the sense of distributing content knowledge and making that more broadly accessible, which is a great thing for the world. In terms of actual scale, you know, our program with USC, or Masters in Teaching, went from 75 students all in Southern California to 1,500 students in 48 US states, 48 out of 50, and 33 countries around the world. So that is an increase of 20x, but it's not hundreds of thousands of students. And so they had to hire a lot of faculty to help manage that process as well. So its scale, in the sense that it is significantly larger, it's now the largest nonprofit school of education in the country. Our Master's in Nursing with Georgetown is now the largest nonprofit Master's in Nursing in the country. It is scale relative to traditional academia, absolutely, but it is not scale and mass, and in hundreds of thousands or millions. And that's challenging when people are required.
Raj, I mean, a similar question for you. Just a business with 10,000 employees is quite large. That's scale in one sense, but I imagine, of course, SAP has clients that are even larger, and the same question, I assume, comes into play. I mean, can they scale the experience of training their employees?
We acquired a cloud organization about a year ago, and
how much did you guys pay for that again?
Too much. But you know, the smallest organization that we looked after was 12 employees. And I had the privilege of spending some time with the director of talent management of the largest company, where we help with the continuous education or learning of their employees. And they had 2.4 million employees. So the reality today is scale is there. But I think we need to reframe the question. It's not whether we can build scale. It's a question of whether we can really get into our heads how people are actually learning today, how they choose to learn. And I'll give you an example. I don't consider myself too old, but you know, when I went to school, my English mother basically said, you're going to learn how to write. So I spent a lot of time practicing my handwriting. Then when I got to university, I learned how to type. Right? Then when I got to my job, I learned to, excuse me, do this. And now my 2-year-old daughters are teaching me how to do this. So, you know, when you think about it, it is really not about scale. It's really trying to reframe the question of how will the generation choose to learn? Because we can build, you know, there was a famous movie in the US about baseball players with Kevin Costner. If you build it, they will come. Well, actually, you can build it, but it could be a ghost town. So the question for us, when we sit down with business, is to really try and understand how are people wishing to learn? And if we can crack that code, we can then leverage all the work that these gentlemen are doing to really make a difference, a positive impact in the business place today, in the world today.
So the answer to this might differ between the two of you, as their clients are different, but let's follow that thread for a moment. What sort of devices and tools are you developing these courses for? Are they these devices, these devices?
Yeah, I mean, for us, you know, again, you cannot turn around and say it's just for this. The world has changed so dramatically that it's now. I want it now. I want it on any device, anytime, anywhere, anyhow. And you can't sort of like stick with, say, an Apple device or an Android device. The key is it's ubiquitous. Get it out. Let's not force someone to make a choice because you have an issue. So for us, everything we do today, everything that we do today is built from a mobile perspective, and that stretches back into your traditional environment. I believe in 5 years' time, the laptop is dead. I personally believe that.
I mean, well, you mentioned in the example of the resort, the whole process starts on email on a phone. Are you talking mobile web or mobile native development?
Look, it's just going to be on a mobile device. The intricacies behind that, I'm not sure. But I believe the days when we have these ladies in front with laptops are going to disappear very, very quickly. Sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you. Because I think that's how we're going to choose to interact with technology and content. Full stop. I mean, just think about it. If you left home today and you left your wallet or your mobile phone at home, which ones of you would go home to get your wallet? Which ones of you would go home to get your mobile device? Simple.
Can't leave home without it.
Absolutely.
And of course, soon there'll be one and the same. So to you, same question.
You know, I actually was glad you asked. It's a really interesting one because it also goes back to something that is fundamentally misunderstood. The reality is that Raj and I are trying to solve very different problems. And if you look back over, take the past 500 years, education really, for a long time, hadn't evolved very much at all. Literally 500 years ago, people were sitting in small classrooms and interacting with fairly knowledgeable human beings who were attempting to impart wisdom. And go back 20 years, and you know, you've now spanned 480 years, and things looked very, very similar. And the sort of infusion of technology into education often gets all bundled together because we've always thought of education as one thing. And the reality is that leveraging technology, you can attempt to solve different types of educational problems in different ways. You couldn't train 2.4 million people if you had to have faculty members for all 10 people. You can do that only because of the benefits of asynchronous technology that lets you connect with a large number of students. And so one of the things that I hope happens over the next couple of years after we go through this mad, rush of or frenzy around online education is that we come to accept that education isn't just one approach. There isn't just one form of online education. The reality is education is what we need as human beings to grow as people and be prepared to interact with the world. To be more successful, happy individuals, we need to educate ourselves, and not just through school, but throughout our lives. And over the next 2 years, I think we're going to start actually talking about what are the best ways to do that, and what are the outcomes, ultimately, that matter, that will allow us to be as happy and productive as we can be.
But that's because we have choice now. I mean, if you go back in time, some of us didn't have, much choice when it came to education. You studied what you chose, what you were told to do, or what you got into, and full stop. I mean, now you have a choice. I mean, I have 3 degrees, right? But I don't really use any of the 3 degrees, which is quite amusing. I have a law degree, I have a psych degree, and I have an MBA, right? But I sell software for a living. Right? Because I had a choice. My father didn't think I had a choice, but I had a choice. And I think that's what's going to change. Because now, to what you're trying to create, you're giving students in America and hopefully the world the choice to access an experience that they wouldn't ordinarily have had, to be able to really, really level set what they're doing.
Well, Raj, so we were discussing earlier about those degrees and discovered that you are the only person on stage who has a degree of higher education. Jeremy and I are both college dropouts, and I think it raises...
I wonder who got it right. I don't know.
Yes, well, we all found our way up on stage somehow. But what I think it raises is an interesting question of credentials. And I wanted to pose that to you, Jeremy, because it comes into play when you go back to the point you were making earlier about the difference between knowledge and learning. So the internet obviously enables democratization of knowledge. So it's easy now to look up a course on YouTube or iTunes U or other services, usually for free, and get a wealth of information. If all you're seeking is to be more educated, you can do that yourself and often at no cost right now from anywhere in the world. You challenge that if you think that's not true. But if you're seeking a credential, a professional degree because it's necessary for the job you want, that's another thing entirely. But I have to think that the two sort of threaten your business a bit, that you need to be able to say that at the end of an online MBA with UNC Chapel Hill, what you come away with is a master's in business administration, and that employers are going to want to see that MBA to pay you more money. But isn't it possible over time that the more that business education is online and free, that employers perhaps start to say that, well, we don't really care about the MBA itself, and then that's then a threat to your business?
Well, so the question is actually a fairly simple one. Had you taken 3 years of Harvard courses from your home as opposed to actually attending Harvard, and same with me for Princeton, would that have impacted your life trajectory in a different way? Was it ultimately very useful to have that experience? And so it comes down to a question of outcomes, ultimately. As you mentioned, we're both shockingly close to finishing from 2 of America's top undergraduate institutions. Speaking for myself, but something tells me you would probably agree, I had a fantastic experience that fundamentally changed my life. the experience of the school and that campus were ultimately what was important for me to impact my life and to change the likely outcomes. And so the degree, ultimately, if you're interested in starting a company and therefore never being hired, like if you don't want Raj to hire you, it is a lot less relevant whether you have that certification. If you want Raj to hire you as a developer, it also may be less relevant because there are probably other ways to test for that. If what you're interested in doing is being a leader within the organization, managing large teams, helping to close deals and scale business, well, it turns out those skills are tougher to learn based on the content knowledge alone. And academia and our educational experience actually has just as much to do with character and personal development, the evolution of the mind, and how you really develop as a human being. And those are the things that employers are looking for in terms of what did you accomplish during your undergraduate or, in many cases, graduate experience. And so I would look at, that's somewhat of an anomaly in terms of the institutions that we attended and where we chose to go otherwise, but ultimately there are different things that matter. In some cases, again, it is that certification, and my guess is even though you're not practicing law, that degree in many ways has been useful for you, and it could be from a signaling standpoint because it signals that you know how to think analytically and can understand contracts. There are ways that it has probably been useful even if you've never had billable hours. And same with us, there are infinite ways that our collegiate experiences have been incredibly useful to us because what matters is actually a mix of things. Part of it is the content knowledge, part of it is the connections, part of it is the signaling effect of having gotten into that school that matter a lot.
So I would agree with all of that with respect to my experience, and as you said, a lot of it had to do with being on campus and the interpersonal interactions I had with fellow students, and then left them. Do you? I mean, but that raises an obvious question for online courses, which is, in what way are you providing an experience that matches, or is similar at least to an on-campus education? Essentially, what's the difference between getting an MBA in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and getting it from your home in Seoul?
And so, excellent question. And it turns out what really matters is being able to develop long-term, lasting connections based on shared experiences. And so, look at demographics. If you were to poll teenage girls in the US, and my guess in South Korea it would be similar, and ask them which relationships are more important to you, your online relationships or your offline relationships, they would say their online relationships are at least as important and at least as relevant to their day-to-day life as their offline ones. The reality is that, one, technology has gotten to a point, and two, society has gotten to a point where you can build online relationships and interactions if you care about making those real and relevant that are deeply meaningful. We had 2 students in our social work program meet on the platform and actually get married. We've had baby showers hosted directly through the platform because students can use it for whatever they want in terms of those types of interactions. There are groups we have a group in New York, MBA at UNC in NYC, that gets together on a weekly basis and has a happy hour together offline, but they organize that through the platform. And so the offline experiences are very useful, and in each of the programs, for instance with the MBA program, you have global immersions where you'll get together as a group in Istanbul, or you'll go to Silicon Valley and you'll be connected with some of the top venture capitalists and entrepreneurs in that part of the world. Those offline experiences are incredibly meaningful and powerful, but you also can build really compelling online relationships, and that's what ultimately matters in terms of life outcomes. It's having those shared experiences and relationships, and you can actually do that online if you care to.
You're really just both building closed social networks.
I think it's not closed. I think it's I wouldn't call it a closed network, but I think it is a selective network.
What's the difference in your mind?
You know, it changes so rapidly. I just wrote a positioning paper off the back of some discussions with some customers, right? And a lot of our customers are challenged because there's just not enough talent in the marketplace to go out. And I said, you know, maybe it's time for us to reframe the question and not look at the cage that has the gorilla, right? But the other way around. And they said to me, he says, what do you mean? I said, how many of you look at it as the individual in a broader context of multiple facets of the individual? And I call it identity, right? The persona of me is not just my professional me. It's my social me, my personal me. And when you bring those all together, there are different elements and different networks. But that's a selected network within a multifaceted approach of me. And when you put that all together, you have the real value of me. And most organizations haven't quite cracked that. And when we put a notion out to someone saying, in the future, given the scarce amount of resource people that we have, is it conceivable that you are going to leverage my network geographically, globally, to solve a business problem, and the team members within that may not be employed by my company. They might have a contractor here, someone else there, and what you're trying to do is to leverage different elements of that network. So I wouldn't say they're closed networks, but I think they're selected networks by me. And if I meet someone who adds value to the value of me, they get invited to my network. It's not that I've closed myself off to them. I just don't know who they are. So that's my perspective.
Sure. I mean, I guess I think of closed in the sense of if you, I mean, for instance, Jeremy, you're certainly charging for entrance into this social network, so to speak. Does the characterization make any sense to you? Does it?
As much as I love disagreeing for the sake of it, in this case, I would have to agree. It is very much a closed network, and part of that actually is a regulatory thing. In terms of data and student privacy, which is obviously a hot button issue, right now, very topical. You can't release student information. You can't share that outside of that academic context. And so you can't let people into that environment and that social network, essentially, as you mentioned, which it inherently is. You can't let them in if they're not part of it, if they're not other students or faculty members. And so it is closed. And in order to gain access, you either have to be a faculty member at that school, because it's not a 2U program, it's a Georgetown program, it's a WashU and St. Louis program, or you have to gain admission through their same admissions process that you'd go through for an on-campus slot. It's the exact same standards, which, by the way, turns out to be pretty important when you're thinking about education outcomes as well. You want to be surrounded by other driven, thoughtful, competent students. And so it very much is a closed social network that allows you to enhance your educational experience, but also remove the geographic barriers that prevent great students from connecting to a great education.
So we're here in Korea, nation that arguably is most focused both culturally and as a business proposition on education. And as you said earlier, Jeremy, I think we probably have more to learn by being here than we have to say about this. But one effect of the privatization of education, where you have students seeking a lot more of their skills learning outside of the public school classroom, is that the public school system is suffering. When we translate that back to what you do, Jeremy, and I think this might apply in certain ways to your business as well, Raj, and we don't have to focus just on your two companies. I might speak to this more generally. Education has traditionally been either a function of the government or, in the United States at least, a function of nonprofit organizations. And so when you add a for-profit layer, that has to change a lot of the incentives. And I'm wondering, because you're coming from the for-profit world on this, I can imagine your perspective, but is this something you grapple with? Do the universities, which are nonprofit organizations that you work with, does the proposition change when they add a for-profit layer or work with a for-profit company like your own?
You know, my guess is that, and I'll let Raj speak for himself, but there are fewer complexities there because it's about the pure outcome of, you know, that piece of education. And so in working with other for-profit companies, there are less potential misalignment of incentives, which is, I think, exactly what you're getting to. And it's the same type of concern that happens in any type of, you know, really public-private partnership, in that you need to ensure that incentives are aligned and that everyone is moving towards the same goal. And so what's happened with many of the proprietary schools, you've probably heard of you know, University of Phoenix and schools like it, the reason that there's such a backlash against them is that they have a fundamental misalignment of incentives. When you look at the data, they spend the largest expense is marketing. And when you look at who is most likely to enroll, it's the least qualified people. And so you create this downward spiral where they're marketing to less and less qualified people because they're the ones most likely to help them hit their enrollment numbers. But as I mentioned a second ago, it turns out that the people in your class with you, the other students, are actually a very important component of your educational outcome, of the impact that's going to have on your life. And so the way that we get around that, the way that we maintain an alignment of incentives, is that we have no control for any of our programs over that which is inherently academic integrity and rigor. We have no control over the admissions process. We have no control over what students learn. It's entirely driven, the curriculum, by faculty at these schools. And their implicit and explicit goal is to maintain the exact same level of rigor as on campus. And so by creating that church and state divide, you're able to maintain sort of this alignment of incentives that otherwise would be a significant issue. And it turns out that there are things that nonprofit institutions are just much better at maintaining over time. Their brand, their reputation, their overall educational experience. You know, Georgetown's been around for 300 years. They've got that part down. What they haven't done is technology development. They haven't done infrastructure and logistics to build out that type of experience online. That's what it turns out private companies are actually very good at doing. And so by marrying those two sides, but maintaining that very sort of strict divide between the two, you're able to create something that is ultimately better than either individual organization would be able to do on their own and works in a very symbiotic way. If you take that divide out, then there are a lot of potential issues that I think we've seen in proprietary schools around the world, and those issues end up lowering academic standards and outcomes for students in a way that's really problematic.
That's fair enough. Raj, do you have any thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, it's a very, very slippery slope down. You know, somewhere in all of this, someone's got to fund it. Somewhere in all of this. For-profit, not-for-profit, ultimately someone's going to fund it. And sometimes there is a willingness to pay above and beyond. I mean, we're fortunate in Singapore that I would say the primary school education is pretty standard across the board. Doesn't matter whether you go to a neighborhood school or you go to a branded school. The only difference between the two is probably tradition, but the education that you get is going to be pretty similar. So I think the challenge when you start talking about education in a different level is, look, how do we get some basic standards in place? Whether it's profit or non-profit, it's about that basic standards. In Singapore, the top 50 kids, when they're 12 years old, you do some government exams, and the top 50 kids have traditionally not come from a branded or a marquee school. They've come from a neighborhood school. And what we've learned from that is if you can get those standards in and you can get those structures in, you can churn out quality students, whatever the school is. So for me, it's hard to say profit, non-profit. I think it's really about the infrastructure that you put in there, and the results will show for themselves.
And of course, it's a bit of a question of what you mean by education at all, which turns out to be the theme of today's panel. So we have to wrap it up here. Jeremy, one last question for you. Do you ever think about going back and finishing that undergraduate degree? And if you did, would you consider doing it through an online course? Does Princeton even offer?
Absolutely, actually. I would love it if Princeton actually has the most restrictive transfer policies of any school in the US. And so currently, I could take courses from, Northwestern, Emory, UNC Chapel Hill, Boston College, really top American universities for credit and have an actual transcript from those schools to take back. The vast majority of schools in the US and around the world would accept that as credit. I only have a year left, plus a thesis. But unfortunately, Princeton does not. They're one of the few schools that would not accept most transfer credit. And so, if and when, and I hope the answer is pretty soon, that changes, then yeah, I would absolutely love the chance to be able to do it. I don't have the ability, 2U as a company started 5 years ago, and we've grown to 600 people in a 5-year period. It's one of the fastest growing education companies in the US right now. I don't have the ability to leave for 9 months and go back to school for that period of time. But I could do it if I were able to create a schedule that worked, essentially, with the rest of my life. So I do hope to be able to. I don't know at what point, but my grandmother reminds me on a roughly quarterly basis that it would be a good idea.
Right, mine too. I'll take the course with you.
Perfect.
Raj, Jeremy, thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.